Dr. Jones, I wanted to ask you guys a question, and Dave, you and I have had this discussion on a couple of occasions. I'm a bit concerned that a lot of cattlemen are disillusioned a little bit about the whole cow weight thing, because we've tended to discuss it in the past a lot about cow size. And I think that a lot of our producers don't realize, I'm glad you showed the evidence of what we're doing with cow weight, because we did get a control over frame size. And I think that's what everybody kind of relates size to frame size. And that's under control. I think all the genetic trends will show that we've leveled that off. But at the same time, we continue to get them bigger and bigger, heavier and heavier. And so my concern is that a lot of producers don't think that they're necessarily have added those pounds because their frame size aren't getting any bigger and they don't weigh the cows. Be interested yours and Aaron's thoughts about that.
I guess my thought on that would just be look at the carcass weights. You know, I see it was not too long ago we hit 960 pound steer carcass weights. I mean, wow. Industry average, okay? And so, that tells you that, you know, that composition, that doesn't have anything to do with frame size, obviously, but, you know, the idea, and I think in Angus it seemed to me like the frame has been consistent or stabilized since about 1982 maybe. So kind of the time we tipped out on Dr. Todashek's last era of insanity and sort of started selecting at least show cattle for moderate frame size. But if the weight continues to increase and frame size is not changing, well, that tells you that there's a lot more mass of muscle, visceral organ mass, which is the most biologically active tissue in the body. Those things suggest that maintenance energy requirements may be increasing. Now, that's a little hard to get corralled. We've worked on that a little bit, and our evidence doesn't suggest maybe that it is increasing that much, but it's a concern. It is definitely a concern. There is a lot of feedback from people about the females not being able to handle these environments that they're subjected to. I was in a meeting in Florida here just a couple of years ago, and those guys have a lot of cows. I mean, each operation, there's a big kind of long table, a producer, manager, whatever, from each of those operations sitting around that table. Each one of them probably had anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 cows. And the purpose for the meeting was, what have we done? That was the question. And it's because they were having lots of years of 70% pregnancy rates. Okay? And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Aaron.
So I guess from my perspective, I work with a lot of commercial cow-calf producers, and we'll develop, a feed ration for them in the spring, looking at their hay. And one of the questions I always ask is, tell me about your cows. Because obviously, in general, bigger cows eat more, and that's what we're going to use as our proxy to figure out how much we're going to feed. And I'll frequently say, well, I've probably got 1,100, 1,200 pound cows. And I'm in my mind, I know that you don't have 1,100, 1,200 pound cows. So then my next question is, well, what do your cows weigh when you weigh them up, when you sell them? Well, they weigh about 1,400 pounds. So somewhere between the ranch and the sale barn, they gained about 200 pounds, right? And there's a lot of good feed on that trailer. Apparently, I need to find that trailer and buy it because I could make a lot of money. So my point is, I think we sometimes want things to be a certain way, but reality is something else. And if we're very real with ourselves we can start looking at cow weight, and we can adjust body condition on that, right? About 80 pounds of cow weight to one body condition. So we can just look at weigh-up cow prices and get a pretty idea, where are my cows at? And we want to believe sometimes what we want it to be, and then when we actually see it, we're sometimes humbled. And I'll just share a quick story. A few weeks ago here was at an operation, not at our operation, visiting with a guy about his operation. He decided to do a mature cow herd dispersal. These would have been primarily Angus cows in Nebraska, and he flat out told me those cows averaged 1,600 pounds. They were in good shape. I mean, 5s and 6s, but he said mature cow herd dispersal, those cows weighed 1,600 pounds. Those are some good sized cows.
I've got over here. Sorry, I'm holding baby, so I'm not gonna stand up. But I've got a couple questions, and this is for anybody, whoever wants to answer it. But on any of these research that you all did, or specifically, I guess mostly the two of you on the right, with the research, did you use genomics in those animals as well to see their genetics before, to select the animals that you used in your research, or it was kind of random, the animals that you used? You can start with that one, and then I can ask the other one, or I can ask it now, either way.
Is this on? I guess I'll start. So with the heifer swap study, we didn't do any prior genetic analysis on the animals that we used. But we know that in Montana, based on their breeding program, that we're dealing with principally Western genetics. The animals we used from Kentucky, the native Kentucky heifers, we bought at the sale barn. They were commercial heifers, black white face heifers. They fit from look what we were looking for, but we don't know for sure if they had Western genetic AI breeding or not. They sure did perform like they knew all about fescue, so that would be my answer.
Yeah, in our program, we are sending samples to both Zoetis and Neogen. Just started sending samples to Zoetis, actually. But yeah, we are trying to collect that data. We contacted both of those groups, and since ours is a commercial cow operation, we said, hey, we just need you to help us find these forage-efficient cows. And you would probably, be some of the best position in industry or business in the country to do that with the technology. Can you help us find these forage-efficient cows so these folks don't have to test for them? We don't have to go through years of developing, markers and so on to find them. And so they are very interested in helping us, and we are working with them. It'll take some time to make that happen because, again, we don't have a very large research operation, and it takes a lot of animals to be able to identify those markers to develop, the genomic values for forage intake and forage performance.
The other question I had was mostly for you in the middle. I can't remember your name, I'm sorry. But Dr. Davis, did those animals ever adapt, like the heifers that you swapped, or did they ever adapt? Because, as we've heard from different producers, we see that commonly. So did it take a couple generations? How does that work?
That's a great question. So I can only speak to how long we kept the heifers, which was October, and I didn't include that data in my talk today, but I can tell you August was the high point for those heifers. They were probably doing as good as they were going to do. By October, there was no signs of adaptation. So they actually started to go downhill again after August. So I'm unsure with multiple years or in the herd, some of those heifers might have adapted. I will tell you that there was some variation. So the averages, right? It looks terrible. Everybody lost weight. Everybody looked awful. There were a couple Montana heifers that looked just like the Kentucky ones. And there were a couple Kentucky heifers that looked just like the Montana ones. And so no, I wouldn't say they adapted, definitely not through 1 year of grazing season, but there is some variation there that could be harnessed.
And this applies to everyone there, but is docility taken into account in any of these trials that you're working through?
We don't put up with the ones that aren't docile, so I couldn't answer your question. They leave pretty quick, and it's a university. We have graduate students, we have undergraduate students. Some of them don't know anything about cattle. We cannot, shoulder the risk of somebody getting hurt, and so they're just gone if they act like that. So the cattle we are testing are pretty docile.
I'll speak to that a little bit too. Same thing. We're taking, I showed you the grazing halters, right? We had to put those on and take them off and get up close to get data. So Our cattle that we got from Montana, they insured had docility considered in their breeding program for the same reasons of what he just said. And the cattle in Kentucky had to be docile in order to actually be used on the trial. We did order extra cattle just so we could get rid of what we weren't going to be able to handle. So we certainly did consider docility.
This is a question for Dr. Lalman. In regards, I'm over here to your left. In regards to doing a trial for yourself, a practical trial for yourself, and keeping your own most efficient heifers through that 70 to 100-day process, is there a percentage that we probably need to be looking at as far as keeping off of that trial? Do we need to keep our top 50% most efficient heifers, or does it need to be the top 20% most efficient heifers?
That's a good question. I would say a couple things come to mind. One is, yes, you're going to need to keep more females than you anticipate putting into your cow herd. But I would force them to meet your fertility criteria first, and then, I don't know if you could. Well, here's what we're doing in Oklahoma. We are keeping double the number of females we think we need to put in our herd, and then we're treating the replacement heifers as a stocker operation, as a separate enterprise. And so, if you do that in a spring calving herd and you preg check early, right after the breeding season, and use a short breeding season. We're using 45-day breeding season, and then preg check early. Well, now we're into late June, maybe middle of July, and that's kind of the end of our really high quality grazing period. And so we can make money on those cattle as a stocker operation. So we preg check then, and anybody, and a lot of producers in that part of the world are doing that. Anybody that's open goes to town, and we make money on them because it's a stocker enterprise. That really fits well with our forage system. And then we keep the ones that performed, really well throughout the winter and even the springtime as far as that goes. So that's kind of how we're dealing with it. The other thing I want to mention relative to that, we had a conversation with Mr. Lowe this morning. Is his question was, well, when I evaluate my cows year after year for fleshing ability, hair shedding, fleshing ability, and basically just adaptability to my environment, and I wind up with moderate, easy fleshing cows, am I doing the same thing, selecting for those kind of females when you say test your heifers for weight gain on moderate quality forage? And I would say, yeah. I think that's pretty much accomplishing the same goal. If you peel off the ones that can't handle the environment, they come in at weaning in a body condition score 3.5 or 4. I think you're probably doing the same thing.
Just curious about the Kentucky-Montana swap. How did those respective groups of cattle react to going from smaller pastures in Kentucky to open range in Montana and vice versa? Did you have any trouble with Montana cattle wanting to go beyond the boundaries on a regular basis?
Well, temperament went down. Poor temperament with endophyte infected tall fescue. So we did see a lot of behavioral issues with those animals. I wouldn't say we didn't have anybody leave the pasture they were in. So nothing that extreme, but certainly behaviorally they were very uncomfortable in their scenario, whether that was the ergovaline in the pasture driving them crazy, or it was because of that adaptation from their normal system to a pastoral system. I don't know. In Montana, they didn't mention anything about having significant issues out on range when they had them out there with those Kentucky cattle. Their gains you saw were pretty consistent with the Montana animals, so they weren't running around and not eating or anything like that. But again, behaviorally, they were certainly became less docile after going to
Claustrophobic.
Montana. Yeah,
Claustrophobic.
exactly.
Brittany, would you mind if I added a little bit?
Of course you can, Les.
They seemed confused, and we sat there and we wondered during the trial, because middle of the day, even on hot days, they're grazing all the time, always out, always grazing. And you stop to think, Dave, I don't know if they'd ever seen green grass, right? I mean.
That's a really good point. And grazing is learned, can be, they figure it out pretty quick if they figure out it's food, but those Montana cattle took a really, really long time to figure it out.
And they're, those calves were born late March up to the 1st of May, and not 100% sure when the end of their, nutritive value in their pastures, it starts to decline. But I'd say that's probably July, mid-July. You were up there, Dave. I don't know, but those calves would have been 120 days and still lactating, and weren't forced yet to graze. And then they were dry lotted, and then they were shipped, and we turned them out on grass. And I wondered if that wasn't the first actual green grass that they'd had access to there, and needed to graze the entire time. And so it's like kid in a candy store, right? They're out just grazing all the time, but they had rumination issues, they had microbial population issues going on in their gut, and a lot of things that we haven't identified yet. But that was one of the weirdest things about the whole trial, is the Montana cattle seemed confused.
Confused is a really good way to put it, actually. They were certainly confused.
Any other questions?
This is for Dr. Davis. In a rotational grazing system, clover is not going to be equal over all paddocks. Excuse me. Does that impact the effect on endophyte toxicity? And then the second part of the question, in Kentucky, or in my area of Kentucky, clover is not growing very well during the periods of most stress to the cattle. So how is that going to impact the toxicity or toxicosis at that point?
So that's a really good question. What I can say is you need so little clover, or at least red clover, to elicit the benefit that even if you had a paddock that had 10%, you had a paddock that had 50%, you're probably okay. That's part of the reason why we're working to develop solutions like a red clover containing mineral or something of that nature, so we can give a little bit more uniform opportunity for that. We don't know, we haven't studied how long. We've done every other day feeding with red clover, but we've never extended it past that to see if there's any residual effect or how long before they turn in to looking the same as the animals that are on the endophyte infected only pastures. So it's difficult to say when you're moving them around or in different scenarios, or they're without that supplement for a week or 2 weeks or a month, when they would start to decline. But I would imagine it wouldn't be very long. So I think consistency, like most functional feeds, it's usually a low dose, but the consistent dose is pretty important. Does that answer your question? Oh, what was the second one? I'm sorry.
High stress time when you have low clover, like in August. The second part was most of the time the clover will not grow when the temperature and humidity is the highest, but that's a high stress period on cattle. So, but your first answer kind of answers that if you had a more consistent source in the mineral or whatever, but we don't have that right now.
Yeah, and then the other thing, I guess, is if you have standing clover, so say you're putting them in a field in August and the clover's not growing, but it's there, right? There's still isoflavones in that clover. It doesn't go away. It does decrease with drying. If you are drying hay out in a field, the vegetative material is higher in isoflavones than that hay that you're harvesting. but I don't think it would decrease to the point where it wouldn't be usable. But certainly a more consistent source is really what we need to achieve.
Brittany, could you supplement red clover hay? So, and that's a great question that you had, because not all paddocks will have the same concentration of clover in them. I mean, if you go into a paddock that had, say, 5% clover, or maybe a really low number, could you just supplement some red clover hay in those pastures to get the same effect?
You bet. The red clover hay works just fine. So that's exactly what we used in our research studies. We did 7.5% red clover hay, and I think I shared with you the 15% red clover hay. We only had to give it every other day and to elicit those same effects. So you certainly could use stored forages as well.
Will soybean meal do the same thing as red clover hay you're discussing?
I don't know how much soybean meal you need to elicit the same effect. Yes, it will. Soybean meal is different in composition, so red clover has a lot of bioquinone and formininettin, which are two isoflavones, and then soybean meal has two degradative products of those that are really high in soybean meal. And so, yes, absolutely soybean meal can work and will work. I don't know the level that would be required.
All right, I think that'll wrap up our Q&A session. Let's give everybody a round of applause up here. Dr. Jones, if I do my math right, Dr. Lalman told us that we had about $2,200 on the low end hanging fruit that we could make with 200 producers. And we made about $200,000 today, Mr. Beeler. So that's a pretty good meeting, right? But anyways, thank you all for coming. Becky wanted me to remind you all there is chili down in the trade show. So if you've got your trade show tickets and all that, be sure to go down and spend some time with the vendors, get you some chili. And again, thank you all for coming out here to Kentucky to the convention. Thanks, everybody.